Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the RV Trip Planning Seminar. We're going to discuss a number of topics this morning, and it'll take a little while, so let's go ahead and get started with this. We're going to discuss RV trip planning. And to give you some idea of the topics that we'll address, we want to look first at why it's so important that we address this now. And frankly, that's because Microsoft is exiting the market. We need a definition of trip planning as opposed to navigation, because so many so-called trip planning tools are actually navigation tools, and they're a little bit cumbersome from a trip planning perspective. We want to talk about what are the capabilities that you might want in a trip planning tool, and based on that, what are the alternatives that are out there? What are the computer programs? We'll focus on Street Atlas Plus, which is a DeLorme product, and the reason that we're focusing on that was because there were two highly rated computer programs. The first and most popular is Microsoft Streets and Trips, but it's disappearing. And the second was Street Atlas. Then we'll talk about some of the web-based sites like Passport America, FMCA, and Good Sam. And we'll take a closer look at one of those in particular because it offers more flexibility. And finally, we'll look at a web-based service, RV Trip Wizard in particular. Once we've done that, we want to look at a comparison between the three types of applications, whether we use a computer program, a web-based site, or a service. And what are the factors in making that decision? There's no one right tool for everyone, but we want to try and help you make that decision. After we do that, we'll take a brief look at Road Trippers, which is a good online tool for specifically day trips. When you get to a location where you're going to park for the evening, it might be nice to do some other things. And the last thing we'll do is we'll do a few demonstrations to give you a sense of how these things work. So, with that in mind, let's continue on. Let's see, I need to select a couple of items here, and we can move on then. Okay, why talk about it? Well, the reason that we're talking about this is because Microsoft made an announcement. Actually, the test lead for Streets and Trips, Laurie Peterson, was quoted as saying, with more and more people turning to their phone or in-car navigation systems, we felt it was the right time to exit the market. Microsoft is going to end all support for Streets and Trips in July of this year. In looking at Microsoft Streets and Trips, people talk about needing a trip planning tool, but in fact, most of the time they use Streets and Trips not for trip planning, but rather for navigation. So if we take a look at a definition of an RV navigation tool, it's intended to provide its primary function is to provide turn-by-turn directions to get between two or more points or through via points using routes that avoid RV hazards, low bridges. Navigation tools frequently include onboard or downloadable point of interest files. And these point of interest files might be add-ons that are used to identify fuel stops, places like Elks Clubs, and so on. Trip planning tools are used in a different way. Trip planning tools are used to lay out and route the route and stops for a complex multi-stop trip based on your particular driving parameters. That is, what's your maximum and minimum miles per day, how fast do you travel, what are your campground preferences, how far can you go between fuel stops. Those kinds of things can be used in trip planning. While many navigation tools allow for trip planning functions, they're a little more cumbersome, and some trip planning tools allow for navigation functions. So what we're saying in the bottom here is some navigation tools are capable of performing trip planning functions, and some trip planning tools are capable of performing navigation functions. What do we want in a trip planning tool? What do we want it to be able to do? Or what's the wish list? If you could develop or design your own trip planning tool, what would you want it to do? Well, I've listed a half a dozen items, and some of them are available today in trip planning tools. Some are available in GPS devices. So by combining the two, we're able to get pretty much what we need. The first thing that I've listed here, and by the way, these items are listed in no particular order, is to be able to create a multi-stop route plan based on your driving patterns. A route plan should include a timeline and be flexible enough to allow for last-minute changes. So if, for example, you lay out a 4 or 5 month trip, you should be able to craft in a rough timeline for that. That same trip planning tool should provide an extensive list of RV parks and campgrounds. I'd like it to include BLM lands, city, county, state, Corps of Engineer parks, National Park Service parks, and both moose and elks clubs that allow for RV parking. These are items that I personally want. I'd like to be able to identify discounts that are accepted for the commercial campgrounds and RV parks, things like Passport America, Good Sam, FMCA, Escapees. There's a long list of those items, along with the contact information for reservations. That's particularly important to me. I'd like to be able to identify truck stops and real-time fuel prices, as well as current weather and traffic along the route. Now, some of the trip planning tools will identify truck stops, all or part of them. They may give me fuel prices. Very few will give me current weather and traffic along the route, but my GPS provides or adds that function. I want to be able to produce an itinerary that can be converted to a CSV file for input to a GPS. CSV is comma-separated variables. It's basically a spreadsheet we use for input, and I use it to quickly generate a Google map from that itinerary, and I use it with other applications. I want to be able to identify nearby attractions along the route. So as we stop for the evening at a via point, I want to be able to take day trips. After all, RVing is about the trip, not the destination. Now, there are several ways of accomplishing this, several trip planning alternatives. I can lay out the trip with a road atlas and a campground directory, which brings me back to the good old days when I first started out, and that's all we basically had. Well, the good old days really weren't so good. It meant a lot of work, and it took a lot of time to lay that out. My next step was to move to Microsoft Streets and Trips. Well, since Microsoft Streets and Trips is going away, I need to be able to replace it with a piece of software. And DeLorme makes a piece of software called Street Atlas USA Plus. It's around $40, and it's suitable for a laptop. It includes some campgrounds, it includes some stops, but in order to add to those stops, I'll use some of the same tools that I used with Streets and Trips, that is, point of interest files. I can download point of interest files from the POI factory, from POI directory, Fleetwood Discovery Owners Group to identify those POIs. The good news is they're available. The bad news is they're a little dated. So I can supplement that by utilizing a service. One example of that service is ultimatecampgrounds.com. It's about $7 a year to use it. And Ultimate Campgrounds not only lists commercial campgrounds, it lists Corps of Engineers, it lists TVA, it lists city, county, state parks, it lists Forest Service sites. It gives you a lot of additional items to look at. Whenever you're looking at POI files, though, you need to pay attention to the last updated dates for the POI files. That'll give you a sense of how reliable that particular database is or how current they are. Now, the first trip planning alternative that we look at in lieu of Streets and Trips is Street Atlas USA. The picture you see there is an example of a Street Atlas USA trip. And what I did is I laid out a trip going from my home in Titusville, Florida, out to Hemet, California. I was able to plug in some parameters for how far I wanted to drive each day. And that's the little blue boxes that you see here. I was also able to lay in approximate points where I would need to stop for fuel, where fuel would be available in a truck stop. So those are laid out going across the country. The first alternatives gives me that capability. I can also import POIs, but you'll see how cumbersome they can become, and I can use that along my trip. A little bit time consuming, but it is an effective tool. The bad news is that it's designed specifically to work with DeLorme GPSs and no other brands, so the outputs are a little cumbersome to work with, and you may have to plug it into your particular GPS. It is a viable tool to replace streets and trips, can be used for trip planning, even though it's actually a navigation. The second alternative, or trip planning alternative, are the commercial sites that are out there. Many of the sites, like Passport America, allow you to plug in via points along your trip and select campgrounds. But in fact, it's again a very time-consuming planner. When you enter a point other than a start or an end point, the search fails, but you can in fact step through this, use a campground search, and search for individual campgrounds around those particular sites. It's again somewhat slow. The price is right though, it's free. The next alternative is to use the FMCA site. You plug in a start point, a destination point, and all of the via points, and FMCA will generate a custom PDF trip plan for you. It uses the mapwizards.com platform. The limit is 10 stops on a trip. And the bad news, or the odd part of this, is that even though it's an FMCA site, it doesn't list any campgrounds, but it will return a very thorough turn-by-turn report, and it will include many point of interest along the route, just no campgrounds. So I view that as a bit of a downer, and the fact that you're limited to 10 stops. If I was going for a couple of weeks, pretty reasonable tool. Beyond that, not so hot. The fourth alternative that we list is actually a very good web-based alternative, and that's the Good Sam alternative. It was actually designed to work with a Good Sam or Rand McNally GPS. It gives me a way, put in a start and a destination point, and then I can highlight campgrounds. There's 3 categories of campgrounds. Campgrounds that are found that are Good Sam member campgrounds, other commercial campgrounds that are found in the Good Sam directory, and some public campgrounds as well. So it gives me a useful listing of campgrounds as I move across the country. And under things to do, it provides some point of interest information that I might find useful. So this is the first so-called one-stop shop for trip planning. The downside to this is that I can't actually input it directly into my GPS. I have to manually input that information unless I have either a Good Sam or a Rand McNally GPS. But the nice part is that it provides the RV warnings for low bridges, items like that. And the point of interface also includes some fuel stops, specifically Pilot and Flying J fuel stops. So somewhat more useful. Cost is nothing, but again, it takes a little time because I got to manually input it. A little bit cumbersome. Overall, of the 3 that we've looked at, I prefer the Good Sam information to what I get from either FMCA or Passport America. though I may from time to time reference the Passport America information for other purposes. The fifth alternative is the one we'll spend the most time on. That's RV Trip Wizard. It is truly a trip planning tool. It was not designed to be a navigation tool. However, it'll generate a comma-separated variable file, a spreadsheet that can be input directly into GPSs. It's a good idea to point out the deltas. It has an annual subscription fee. So this one isn't free. It costs you $39 a year. And that's going to put some folks off. However, from my perspective, the cost is more than offset by the flexibility, easy use, and the time savings generated with the service. It's a web-based service, so maps, directions aren't available when you have internet service. However, it will generate an itinerary that you can print out and a spreadsheet that, again, can be printed out or stored on your computer. It kind of works around those deltas. RV Trip Wizard uses driving preferences to set up an adjustable inner, middle, and outer range. So what we're looking at is driving ranges, and that'll in turn generate concentric circles around your starting point or your via point in order to help you select the next point along the trip. Very useful. Once a via point is selected, the new set of radius points are displayed with a selected campground or stopping point as the center of the new circle, identifying campgrounds along the route for succeeding via points. So my primary or first step is to lay out my trip, determine the campgrounds I'm going to stop at as via points, and then to move on from there. Now, those via points automatically include pertinent information about the campground. What's the arrival date, the length of stay, the location, the contact information, campground ratings, and so on. It's, for me, a more useful tool. What we see here is a map that shows what I was talking about. As I select this particular Passport America site, I'll see via points around it, or I'll see concentric circles at 250, 300, 350 miles. I can then select a site inside that circle, make it my next via point, and step on through. What we happen to be looking at is a trip that we have planned for this summer that'll have 45 stops on it and cover about 4 months. When we look at this Trip Wizard, this is the screen that you normally focus on. This is the trip planner screen. So as you enter a city or an address, it's added to the list, and actually towards the bottom of the screen, bottom center of the screen, you can plug it in anywhere in the middle or at the end, your choice. And it provides some supplemental information that's useful. But this is how we go about selecting a particular via point. If I select that via point, if I click on it, what happens is it'll zoom in on the screen and give me information about that via point. And that information includes rating of the campground, how many sites are available, what's the phone number, where is it physically located, and what are the features. When I choose to print the trip, if I hit the print button, what happens is that I'll generate an itinerary. And this is what the itinerary looks like. So it gives me a stop name, how far I've driven, what's my total distance driven, what's my expected arrival date and departure date, how many nights am I going to spend at each site, where's it located, what's its telephone number, and any additional information that may be pertinent about the campground is also provided in this itinerary. Additional capabilities include an online use of MapQuest gas pricing for the individual via points, so I can determine where the cheapest fuel is around there. And by the way, it isn't simply gas, it's fuel pricing. There is a diesel option. And there are some limited POIs, really commercial POIs, available with RV Trip Wizard. What I've done to enhance that is we've added POIs to our navigation tool, to our GPS. Okay, and we'll go into a Trip Wizard demo a little later. So in terms of comparisons, we want to look at this in terms of features. Does it generate a multi-stop route plan? Is there a timeline available? Are the campgrounds identified? Is contact information provided? Can the campground rating and are the campgrounds rated? Yes or no? And does it generate an itinerary? Is there a CSV and Excel file for GPS? Well, I've identified that for Street Atlas, for Good Sam Trip Planner, and for RV Trip Wizard. So it tells me which of the features I'm looking for that a particular tool gives me. So this is a way that I can look at these things and decide which one to go with. Now, for my money, I prefer RV Trip Wizard. However, if I wanted to save money, I would and wasn't worried about being online, I'd use a Good Sam Trip Planner because it'll allow for a multi-stop route plan. It's kind of limited at around 30, somewhere in that neighborhood. It doesn't give me a timeline. The campgrounds are those that we would find in the Good Sam directory, so it's somewhat limited there. It does give me contact information. It identifies the campground features, and it provides the ratings for the campground. Does it generate an itinerary? No. Can we generate an Excel file from it? Not really. We have to go directly into the ports for those things. Will it give me real-time fuel prices? Yeah, but only for Pilot and Flying J. If I'm okay with getting my trip planning information off the web, I might use Good Sam's Trip Planner. If I don't want to be restricted by the web, or I'm out in the pucker brush, in the boondocks somewhere, then maybe what I need to use is something like Street Atlas USA. It will allow me to do multi-stop route planning. It'll give me the campgrounds, and it'll generate an output file, and it can contain points of interest. So those are the positives. So the decision is yours to make based on the factors that are most important to you. If you want internet independence, then something like Street Atlas USA is a better solution for you. If cost, the annual cost bothers you, then take a look at the Good Sam Trip Planner. If ease of use and time to lay out a complex trip is important to you, RV Trip Wizard might be the solution. Once we've gotten to a particular campground, there's something else that we should look at in those via points, and that is road trippers. This is another website that you might want to look at before you hit the road. Is there anything to do around the points where we're stopping? It generally provides a pretty good list of what might be worth seeing near your trip stops. In terms of sites, generally it's a very, very good tool. And I tend to want to do this because RVing is really about the trip, not the destination. What I want to do next is demonstrate some of what we've been talking about, or show you what it looks like from a live perspective. So let me do that. Let's start with Lorem Street Atlas. All right, so let me share that with you, and we'll take a look at it. Here I've laid out a trip between my home in Titusville and Hemet. You'll notice I came up with 8 stops going across the country, and those 8 stops are pretty much where I want to stop for the evening. Well, it took me a while to lay this out, but you'll also notice that in here, it also identifies fuel stops along the route. To begin with, we're up on a map file. I told you about something called Ultimate Campgrounds. I told you it was a point of interest file. In the case of Street Atlas, point of interest files are placed in the X data folder. And when I turn it on, it'll add all of those campgrounds. Well, that kind of covers you up and makes it a little difficult to look at. But if we zoom in, as you go point to point, you can see where those campgrounds are located at. And we can get information on a particular campground. If I just pull up information, pulls up the info folder, and it says there's a campground. It gives me the lat and lon, which is what I need for my GPS, gives me the name of the place, provides the comments. In some cases, it'll include the telephone number, tell me the nearest town. So it's information that, again, is useful to me. In addition to that, we can find point of interest along the way. And this is what I've done is I previously, based on my starting point, selected these same ultimate campground entries along the route. So based on distance from the starting point, I've got those specific campgrounds. I can also select a particular type of point of interest, and it'll pull it up along the current route. And the way I want it along the current route is so many miles from the center of that route in each direction. DeLorme's tool is there. It can be used for trip planning. It is somewhat limited, and it won't generate the same output files that Microsoft's did that you were able to use with your GPS. But it's the best alternative that I've found available for a computer-based application. A second alternative that we can use are the web-based solutions. And in terms of web-based solutions, let's see if I can't pull this up. Let's take a look at the Good Sam Club. There's the Good Sam Club. And basically, you can pre-plan your trips. I laid a trip out in January called Hula and Hemet, and that's what you're seeing. And last summer, we did the Grand Circle. There it is. So you can see how convoluted that gets. Let's go west a little bit, further west. So you can see that these sites are laid out as we made the Grand Circle. The problem with this was it ran out of capabilities at the 22nd site in this case. Typically, it'll go up to around 30. We actually had about 40 sites total on that trip. Each site is a particular location. It might be a national park. It might be a campground. If I want to see the campgrounds in that area, I can select campgrounds. Let's look at public campgrounds to see what's displayed. It tells me there are 20 of them there. And if I select one, we can see that it's the Navajo National Monument. I can get more information about it if I so choose. It'll tell me a little bit about it, how big it is, whether it'll support slide outs or not. This one doesn't actually meet my needs, so let's close that down. Go back here, close that up, and let's shut those down and take a look at the private campgrounds in the area. It tells me that there are 25 private campgrounds in the area that I'm looking at, and it also tells me we've got 14 campgrounds. So for example, this is Gilding's Monument Valley RV Park and Campground, which is where we actually stayed. And it does provide us a usable list of campgrounds. A little cumbersome to work with, but overall a pretty decent tool. In addition to campgrounds, we can look at things to do in the area. If I need to get fuel, which it at least gives me the pilot stops that are along the route, or Flying J stops that are along the route. If there are any rest areas, it identifies where those rest areas are located. It gives me an idea of festivals that might be going on in the area. And there's no telling what a festival is going to be. St. George Art Festival, if I need more information, I can find out about it. I can also go to the website and find out how long it's running and all of that. Let's take a look at the Great Outdoors. We got 63 sites there. So it's things to do. Cedar Breaks National Monument. At any rate, you get the idea. There are point of interests available in the Good Sam Club website. And next, we'll take a look at RV Trip Wizard. RV Trip Wizard is also web-based. Here we've pulled up a trip that we have planned for later this year that has 40 stops on it. Let's go about what's necessary to set this thing up and to start a new trip. In terms of trip preferences, let's go there first. Well, maybe we'll go there first. I need to log back in because this has been up for quite a while. Once it's logged back in, it'll show me my trip preferences. I can conservatively estimate my miles per gallon, what the fuel cost is or current average fuel costs are. Personal expenses, that's a swag. That's all there is to it. I can identify my driving preferences. What's my average driving speed for a day? How far do I want to go in that day? And typically I want to go between 250 and 350 miles. So I set the 3 concentric radiuses at 250, 300, and 350 miles. I then simply move to the second step. And in the second step, what we'll do is identify the campground's preferences. Where do I want to stay? Do I want to stay at a AAA site? At BLM campgrounds? There's a long list of items that we can list in here. If you're a member of Coast to Coast, I might want to include those items. I'm not, so I don't. If you're an escapee, you want to list the skip discounts and the skip co-ops and so on. You prioritize these from 1 to whatever. So we'll save it and then we'll go to the trip planner. In the trip planner, it'll pull up my last trip that I was working on, which is our summer trip. And it takes a little while to populate that information. Once it does, we can go in and look at it. Or more appropriately, what I'll do is we'll start a new trip. Should be about finished. There we go. Okay, so if I want to start a new trip, simply say, give me a new trip. And we'll call this Hemet. And I'm just going to grab an arbitrary date. I know that it's not correct, but we want to create a trip. I want to use my current starting point. And let's put an address in here. Set that as a start point. There we go. Now I've got a starting point. Then I'm going to enter a second address, and we'll call that Hemet, California. We'll find it. We want to set up that as into the trip, and that gives us our trip destination. So let's go back out on this. And what we've got is we've got a trip that's going to move across country. First thing I want to do is select the location in Titusville. I want to step out a little bit in distance because I want to drive first day a couple hundred miles, 250 miles maybe. And what we see is we start to see the circles forming. So based on that, I want to look at something maybe around Tallahassee. So I'll double click on it, which will force it to come in that general area. And somewhere in that neighborhood, I want to grab a campground, Passport America, that'll do. So what I do is I've said, oh, all right, I found a campground. Let's take a look at that campground and see what it says. It tells me that it's rated at 3.5 stars. Well, I'm only going to be there one night. It's Passport America, 30 sites. RV length is fine. All the sites are pull-throughs, perfect for an overnight stop. The prices don't mean much, but I just want this for one night. And I want it to occur after the first step in the process. So let's add it in there and see what happens. Once I've added it in there, I can select it. And now I need to find another campground. By the way, I was 316 miles at Beaver Lake Campground. That seems like a reasonable distance. So let's look in the Gulfport area somewhere and see what we can find there. Let's see, maybe Biloxi. Cajun RV Park, site we've been to before, kind of like it. So let's add it in there. We want to stay there one night. And let's add this after step 2. Add it to the trip. And as you can see, it becomes fairly easy. Let's get something around Beaumont, which should get us around 300 miles. Boomtown, USA. Well, let's go to the Escapees Park. East Lucas RV Park. We'll add that after 3, and we'll add it to the trip. Select it, which makes it the center point again. Zoom out. And there we go. So we want something around San Antonio. Let's zoom in again. And based on that, don't want to be right in the city. It's on the route. Let's go to Shamrock RV Service and Sales. It doesn't sound too good to me. Let's take another look, though. Let's see where that is. How far is that? That's about 245 miles. I should be able to drive a little further than that. So let's squeeze out a little bit further. Maybe on the other side of San Antonio, we can find something that appeals to us. How about this? Alamo Fiesta RV Resort. Let's see what Alamo Fiesta RV Resort looks like. Alamo Fiesta RV Resort. 307 miles looks like the right distance. So we want to add that in there as occurring after 4. Add it to the trip. And as you can see, we're able to step through step by step, add in the campgrounds until we get to Hemet. Happens very quickly when we get our initial campground setups. We now have a site in Central Texas, so let's step out again. Let's close that. $330 miles, Saratoga, Texas. We can do that. Let's add it after 5. Grab it again. Close this down. Should get us out of Texas, which is kind of what we want. Get a little past Las Cruces is reasonable. Oh yeah, lots of cheap sites there. So let's grab a Passport America somewhere. What do they say about this place? I don't know. It doesn't look too good. So let's try a Dreamcatcher. Not great, but okay. How about, let's go back to Dreamcatcher. Or let's see what we've got here. El Rancho. Maybe a little off the beaten track here. Hidden Valley Ranch RV Resort. That's as good as any. Let's grab that. Site number 7. After 6. Add it to the trip. Grab it. We want to get somewhere up in the Mesa area. Lots of campgrounds up there. Oh, yeah. 300 miles, about the right distance. Let's grab it. Put it after 7. and that leaves us 350 miles to Hemet. So now if we show the entire trip, we can see where we're at, how we're going all the way out there. That pretty much takes us through what we would use in terms of RV Trip Wizard. So we've looked at RV Trip Wizard, we've looked at Street Atlas, and we've looked at the Good Sam alternative. That gives us 3 different approaches that we can use for RV trip planning. My personal preference is the RV Trip Wizard, but it's not right for everyone. So I suggest that you make your selection based on what your priorities are, what's most important to you. Thanks, and have a great day.